You'll live in the guest room until the divorce is final. Olivia takes the master." Nathan Caldwell said it while sweeping his arm across the mantel, sending Claire's mother's framed photograph crashing to the floor, glass exploding at his feet. He didn't even look down. He crushed the broken frame under his heel, turned to the woman smiling in the doorway, and dropped the divorce papers on the table, where his wife of 10 years still ate breakfast that morning. No apology, no shame, just a stranger already measuring the walls, while Claire's whole life splintered beneath his shoe. If a story about a quiet woman underestimated by the wrong man moves you, subscribe and stay to the very end, because this one turns in ways you won't see coming. And comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far Claire's story travels tonight. Claire Whitmore heard the front door open at 7:40 in the evening, and she knew before she turned around that something was wrong. It wasn't the sound of the door. It was the second set of footsteps. Nathan never brought anyone home without telling her first. In 10 years, he had built an entire empire on the principle that the home was private, that the home was where the mask came off. So when she heard heels clicking across the marble behind his familiar stride, her stomach dropped before her mind could explain why. She stood up from this couch, and there he was. And there she was. The woman was tall, poised, wrapped in a coat that cost more than most people earned in a month, and she stood in the doorway of Claire's living room, the way a buyer stands in an open house, already imagining where her own things would go. "Claire," Nathan said. His voice was calm. That was the first thing that terrified her. He was calm. "This is Olivia." Claire didn't answer right away. She looked at her husband, searching his face for the thing she expected to find there: guilt, shame, the flicker of a man caught. It wasn't there. What she found instead was comfort. He looked comfortable the way a man looks when he's finally stopped pretending. "Nathan," she said slowly, "who is this?" "I think you already know," he said. Olivia extended a hand, gracious, almost gentle. "It's nice to finally meet you, Claire. I've heard a lot about you." Claire did not take the hand. She let it hang there in the air between them until Olivia lowered it and the woman's polite smile tightened just slightly at the corners. "I've heard nothing about you," Claire said. "Not one word." "That's going to change," Nathan said. And then he did the thing she would remember for the rest of her life. He walked past her. He walked past his wife of 10 years, into the living room she had decorated, past the paintings her late mother had left her, and he set a manila folder on the coffee table with the ease of a man placing his keys in a bowl. He'd done this 1,000 times, that gesture, coming home setting something down. Only tonight what he set down was the end of everything. "What is that?" Claire said. It wasn't really a question. "Paperwork," Nathan said. "I'd like us to handle this like adults." "Handle what?" "Come on, Claire." He sighed, and there was impatience in it. The impatience of a man who had already had this entire conversation in his head and was annoyed that she was making him say it out loud. "You're a smart woman. You felt it. This hasn't been a marriage in a long time." "I felt nothing," Claire said, "because you told me nothing. I made you dinner 3 nights ago, and you kissed me and said you had a late meeting." "I did have a meeting." Olivia looked away, examining the crown molding. "With her," Claire said. Nathan didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He simply spread his hands as if the details were beneath him, as if the specifics of how he'd lied were a distraction from the larger, more elegant truth he wanted her to accept. "The point," he said, "is that I've made a decision, and I'd like you to respect it. You brought her into our home. It's my home, Claire." The words landed like a slap, not because they were cruel, though they were, because of how easily he said them. My home. As though the years she'd spent in it, the money her family had funneled into it, the walls she'd chosen the color of meant nothing. As though she'd been a guest all along and just now was learning the terms of her stay. "Olivia is going to be staying here for a while," Nathan continued. "The guest suite is available. It'll be more comfortable for everyone if we're all reasonable about the transition." Claire actually laughed. It came out of her before she could stop it short and disbelieving. "You want me to live here, while she lives here. I want us to be civilized. You want me in the guest suite." "I want Olivia in the guest suite," Nathan corrected, and that was somehow worse. He'd already assigned the rooms. He'd already mapped the house. In his mind, the reallocation was complete. "You'll stay in the master until things are finalized. I'm not throwing you out on the street, Claire. I'm being generous." Generous. She turned the word over in her mind like a stone. He genuinely believed it. That was the thing that stunned her most. Nathan Caldwell stood in the wreckage of the vow he'd made her and believed he was being generous. "Nathan," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, "do you remember our wedding?" He blinked. The question knocked him off his script. "What? Our wedding. Do you remember what you said to me, in front of 200 people, in front of my father?" "Claire, this isn't—" "You said I was the reason you'd never fail. You said as long as I stood beside you, there was nothing you couldn't build." She took a step toward him. "You cried, Nathan. You cried." For half a second, something moved behind his eyes. A memory, a younger man, and then it was gone, sealed over, and the practiced calm returned. "People change," he said. "I was different then." "No," Claire said. "You were honest then." Olivia cleared her throat softly. "Perhaps I should give the two of you a moment." "No," Claire said, without looking at her. "Stay. You're going to be living here, apparently. You should hear how the man you've chosen talks to the woman who built his life." "Claire," Nathan warned. "How long?" Claire asked. "How long what?" "How long has it been? Her, this. How long have you been lying to my face at my own dinner table?" Nathan straightened his jacket. It was a tell she'd learned to read across 10 years of marriage. He did it when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. 8 months, he said. 8 months. Claire absorbed it. She had a strange floating sensation, as if she were watching herself from across the room. 8 months. She thought of the anniversary trip they'd taken in the spring, the way he'd held her hand on the balcony and told her he'd never been happier, 4 months into it. She thought of the night her father had a health scare, and Nathan had held her while she cried and whispered that he'd always take care of her. 6 months into it. "You held me," she said quietly. "When my father was in the hospital, you told me you'd take care of me." "And I will," Nathan said, gesturing at the folder. "The settlement is fair, more than fair. You'll be comfortable. You won't want for anything." "You were with her that whole time." "Claire, answer me." "Yes." He said it flatly, and then as though he could not help himself, as though the honesty of it was a relief, he added, "And it was the first time in years I felt like myself." The room went very still. Olivia looked at the floor. Even she seemed to understand that a line had been crossed, that some things a man should not say out loud, even when he means them. But Claire didn't cry. That surprised him. She could see it register on his face, the small disappointment. He'd braced for tears. He'd probably choreographed the whole evening around them. Claire weeping, Claire pleading, Claire asking the question every betrayed wife asks, "What does she have that I don't?" And Nathan graciously, generously comforting her through it, while a beautiful stranger watched him be strong. He'd wanted an audience for his own kindness. She wasn't going to give it to him. Instead, she walked to the coffee table and picked up the folder. "You're reading it now," Nathan said, and there was surprise in his voice, and underneath the surprise, something that was almost pleasure. He thought she was folding. He thought the fight was already over. "You brought it into my home," she said. "The least I can do is read it." She sat down on the edge of the couch and opened it, and she read. She read every page, not skimming, reading. Nathan shifted his weight, checked his watch, glanced at Olivia. He was a man used to being the center of every room, and Claire's calm, quiet attention to the document was somehow deflating him. He'd expected an explosion. He was getting a librarian. And as Claire read, something began to happen that Nathan could not see. She began to notice things. The papers were thorough, beautifully drafted. Some very expensive lawyer had gone through the marital assets with great care. The house, the accounts, the company holdings. Nathan had accounted for all of it, divided all of it, assigned all of it, with the confidence of a man who believed he understood everything he owned. But he didn't. Because Nathan Caldwell had spent 10 years telling a story, and somewhere along the way, he'd started to believe it. The story went like this. Nathan built Caldwell Development from nothing. Nathan the visionary. Nathan the self-made man. Nathan who married a nice, quiet woman named Claire and carried her along on the tide of his genius. It was a good story. The newspapers loved it. The magazines printed it. Nathan repeated it so often at dinners and galas that it had hardened into fact in his own mind. And because he believed his own story, he'd made a mistake in these papers. Several mistakes, actually. Small ones, technically. Enormous ones, in truth. He'd listed the house as a marital asset to be divided. But the down payment on the house, the guarantee that had made the mortgage possible, when Nathan's credit was still shaky in the early years, had come from a trust. Claire's trust, and the trust had conditions Nathan had never bothered to read because reading Claire's paperwork was beneath a self-made man. He'd listed a percentage of the company as her fair share generously, as he kept saying, but 3 of Caldwell Development's largest holdings were tied to introductions, guarantees, and equity arrangements that traced back not to Nathan and not even to Claire, but to Whitmore Holdings, her father's company. The investment network that had given Nathan his very first deal back when he was a nobody, with a good suit and a bad haircut, standing in a conference room Richard Whitmore had let him into as a favor to his daughter's new boyfriend. Nathan had forgotten all of that, or more precisely, he had rewritten it. In his version, he'd earned those rooms. In his version, Richard Whitmore had been lucky to know him. Claire remembered the truth, and now reading these papers, she understood something that made her heart begin to pound, not with grief, but with a strange, cold clarity. Nathan didn't just not know how much he owed her. Nathan didn't know how much he owed her family, and her family's fingerprints were on the very foundation of the empire he was so proud of. She turned the last page, she closed the folder, and she looked up. "You said this is fair," she said. "Extremely fair," Nathan said. "I had it reviewed." "By whom?" "My people." "Your people," Claire repeated. "Did any of them look at where the original financing came from, the house, the early holdings?" Nathan waved a hand. "That's ancient history. Don't complicate this, Claire. You always do this. You get lost in details." "I get lost in details," Claire said softly. "You do. It's exhausting, honestly. This is why—" He stopped himself. "This is why what?" "Nothing." "No, finish it. This is why what, Nathan?" He looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely, and she saw the contempt underneath the thing that had probably been there for years curdling. "This is why it's hard to be around you," he said. "You never see the big picture. You just count things. He didn't look at Olivia, but he tilted his head toward her. "She sees me, the whole me, not the receipts." Claire nodded slowly, as though he'd told her something useful, which in fact he had. Then she reached into the folder, took out the last page, and picked up the pen from the table. Nathan's whole posture changed. The contempt vanished, replaced by something eager, something almost boyish. "You're signing?" "Yes," Claire said, and she signed. She watched his face light up. 10 years, and she could read every muscle in it. This was triumph. This was a man who had gambled that his wife would collapse and had just watched her collapse right on schedule. He turned to Olivia with the smallest, most satisfied nod, the nod of a man saying, "See, I told you no drama, she's reasonable, this is going to be clean." What Nathan did not see, because Nathan had never in his life read the fine print of anything that concerned Claire, was what she had actually signed, because Claire had not signed the settlement. Claire had signed the acknowledgement of receipt, a single line at the bottom of the last page standard in any formal transmission of legal documents. It confirmed one thing and one thing only, that the recipient had received the papers, not agreed to them, not accepted them, received them. It was the legal equivalent of signing for a package at the door. She capped the pen. She set it down. "There," she said. "Thank you," Nathan said, and he meant it in the awful way that made it worse. "I knew you'd understand. This is the mature thing, Claire. Years from now, you'll see it was the right call for both of us." "I'm sure I will. Olivia, why don't you take your things up to the guest suite? Claire, we can figure out the master bedroom situation tomorrow. There's no rush." "Pack my personal belongings," Claire said. Nathan blinked. "What?" "You heard me. My personal belongings. My mother's paintings. The jewelry that's mine, not the pieces you gave me, the pieces I came in with. My books, my files. Pack them. Or have someone pack them. I don't care. But I want them out of this house by the end of the week." Nathan laughed. It was a small, indulgent laugh, the laugh of a man dealing with a woman being dramatic. "Claire, come on. Don't make this a scene. There's no need to rush off anywhere. Be reasonable. Where would you even go?" And that right there was the sentence that told Claire everything she needed to know about how little Nathan Caldwell understood the woman he'd married. Where would you even go? As though she had nowhere. As though she were a stray he'd been kind enough to house. As though 10 years of standing beside him managing the foundation, protecting the investments, holding relationships together with partners who trusted her far more than they trusted Nathan's charm, had left her with nothing of her own. "I'll go home," Claire said. "This is your home." "No, Nathan." She stood up. She was calm. She had never in her life felt so calm. This was your home. You just told me so. My home is somewhere else. It always was. I just forgot for 10 years because I loved you, and you counted on me forgetting." Olivia had gone very quiet. She was watching Claire now with an expression that had changed. When she'd walked in, she'd looked at Claire the way you look at an obstacle. Now she was looking at her the way you look at a woman who has just stood up out of the ashes without a single burn on her, and you're beginning to wonder if you were standing in the wrong place all along. Claire walked to the entryway. She picked up her purse, and then she stopped and turned because there was one more thing, and she wanted to see his face when she said it. "You had it reviewed," she said, "by your people." "Yes," Nathan said, wary now. "You should have had it reviewed by mine." She took out her phone, and she dialed a number she knew by heart, and she put it to her ear, and she watched Nathan's confidence begin very slowly to crack. "Who are you calling?" he said. Claire held up one finger. "Wait." The line connected. "Rachel," she said. "It's Claire. I need you to come to the house tonight." "Yes, tonight." A pause. "He served me." "Yes, and Rachel." Her eyes never left Nathan's face. "Bring the Whitmore file, all of it, especially the early Caldwell financing." "Yes, that file." She hung up. "Who is Rachel?" Nathan said. His voice had lost some of its music. "Rachel Morgan," Claire said. "My family's attorney. She's handled Whitmore Holdings for 20 years. She handled the paperwork that got you into your very first deal, Nathan, though you probably don't remember because you were too busy shaking my father's hand and telling him you'd make him proud." She slid the phone back into her purse. "She's going to come look at these beautiful papers your people drafted. And then I think we're all going to learn a few things about who actually owns what in this marriage." For the first time all evening, Nathan Caldwell said nothing, because there was nothing in his script for this. He'd rehearsed the tears, the pleading, the question about what Olivia had that Claire didn't. He'd prepared to be gracious, to be generous, to be the bigger person. He had not prepared for a wife who read the fine print. He had not prepared for a lawyer named Rachel Morgan. And he had certainly not prepared to have the phrase Whitmore Holdings spoken aloud in his living room like a verdict. "Claire," he said, and now finally there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not love, not shame, fear. "Let's not turn this into a war." "I didn't start a war, Nathan," Claire said, opening the front door. "You did. You just assumed you'd already won it." She stepped out into the evening, and behind her in the house that had been theirs, she heard him call her name once more, and she heard the way it caught in his throat, and she did not turn around. Rachel Morgan arrived at 9:40 that night, a leather bag in one hand and a look on her face like a woman who had seen this exact thing 100 times and was tired of watching good women get ambushed by men who mistook silence for weakness. She hugged Claire at the door of the Whitmore family estate, the estate Claire had grown up in, the estate that had never once left Claire's name. "How much did he offer you?" Rachel said, dropping the bag on the long table in the study. "He called it generous," Claire said. Rachel snorted. "They always do." She opened the divorce folder Claire had brought with her and began to read, and within about 90 seconds she stopped, looked up over her glasses and said, "He drafted this himself, didn't he? Or someone who's never met your father?" "Why?" "Because whoever wrote this," Rachel said, tapping the page, "treats the lakeside property as a jointly acquired marital asset." "It's the house we live in." "It's the house you live in," Rachel corrected. "The down payment came out of your grandmother's trust, and your grandmother's trust has a clause your husband apparently never read, because reading it would have required him to admit that the house he brags about was bought with your family's money." She flipped a page. "And this? Oh, this is even better. He's offered you a 9% stake in Caldwell Development as your fair share of the business." "Is 9% bad?" Rachel looked at her, and slowly a smile spread across her face, and it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a lawyer who has just been handed the other side's mistake gift-wrapped with a bow. "Claire," she said, "you don't need him to give you a stake in Caldwell Development. You already have one. You've had one for years. 3 of his flagship holdings are structured through vehicles that trace back to Whitmore Holdings. Your father set them up that way in the beginning when the banks wouldn't touch Nathan to protect the family's exposure. Nathan signed those documents. He just never understood them." Claire sat down slowly. "How much?" she said. "I'll need to run the exact numbers," Rachel said. "But roughly, the man who just handed you 9% of his company as a favor doesn't actually control his own company. Not cleanly, not without you." She closed the folder. "He built a kingdom, Claire, but the ground it's standing on has your family's name on the deed, and he forgot." Claire looked out the dark window toward the city, where somewhere Nathan was probably pouring Olivia a drink and telling her the worst was over. "He didn't forget," Claire said quietly. "He rewrote it. In his head, he did it all himself. He needed to believe that. It made him feel like a great man." "Well," Rachel said, gathering the papers into a neat stack, "the nice thing about paperwork is that it doesn't care what he needs to believe." For a long moment, Claire didn't speak. She was thinking about 10 years. She was thinking about the balcony in the spring and the hospital in the winter and the wedding where he cried. She was thinking about how she had made herself smaller and smaller year after year so that Nathan could feel large, and how she had told herself that was love, that a good wife supports, that a good wife stands behind, that a good wife doesn't need credit as long as she has loyalty. She'd had it exactly backwards. She'd given him the loyalty, he'd taken the credit, and when he was finished taking it, he'd brought another woman home and told Claire to be mature. "Rachel," she said, "I don't want to destroy him." Rachel raised an eyebrow. No. Claire shook her head slowly. "I want him to see, that's all. I want Nathan Caldwell to stand in a room full of the people he's spent 10 years performing for, and I want him to finally see who was holding him up the whole time. And then I want to walk away, not because I'm running from anything, because I'm finally free to." Rachel studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded, and there was respect in it. "There's one more thing you should know," Rachel said, "and it changes the timing of all of this." "What?" "The Caldwell annual reception. It's in 3 weeks." "I know. I planned the first 6 of them. This year Nathan's using it to announce a merger, a big one, the biggest deal of his career. He's partnering with Reed Global." Claire went still. "Reed," she said. "Alexander Reed, CEO, Nathan's biggest rival for the last decade." Rachel watched her carefully. "He's been telling investors for months that this merger is going to double the company overnight. It's the whole reason he feels untouchable right now. It's probably the reason he finally felt comfortable enough to bring his mistress home and hand you papers. In his mind, Claire, he's about to become one of the most powerful men in the city. He thinks nothing can touch him." "And the merger," Claire said slowly. "Does the merger touch the Whitmore holdings?" Rachel's smile returned slow and sharp. "The merger," she said, "cannot legally close without disclosing the true ownership structure of those 3 flagship holdings, which means it cannot legally close without your name coming up. Nathan hasn't disclosed it. I'd bet the estate on it. Because disclosing it would mean admitting in front of Alexander Reed and a room full of investors that the great self-made Nathan Caldwell needs his ex-wife's family to sign off on the deal of his life." Claire sat very still in the study of the house she'd grown up in, and for the first time since Nathan had walked through the front door with another woman on his arm, she felt something other than the numb, floating shock of betrayal. She felt her spine straighten. "So he needs me," Claire said. "He needs you," Rachel said. "He just doesn't know it yet. And in 3 weeks, he's going to stand up in front of everyone he wants to impress and announce a deal he can't actually make, unless someone tells him the truth first." Claire thought about that. She thought about it for a long time, and then she said, "No, don't tell him. Let him build the whole thing. Let him send the invitations and rent the ballroom and rehearse his speech about being self-made. Let him stand up there in front of Alexander Reed and every investor in the city, so proud, so certain." She looked at Rachel. "And then let the truth walk in through the front door, the way he walked her into mine." Rachel Morgan looked at the quiet woman across the table. The woman Nathan Caldwell had spent 10 years underestimating the woman he'd handed a folder to and told to be mature, and she began slowly to laugh. "You know," she said, "your father always said you were the smart one. He said Nathan had the mouth, but you had the mind." She started packing her bag. "I'll have the full numbers by Monday. I'll reach out to a few of the partners quietly, the ones who trust you more than they trust him. And Claire, yes. When this is over, you're going to be fine, better than fine. You understand that, don't you?" Claire looked toward the window again, toward the lights of the city, toward the life she was about to walk out of and the one she was about to walk into. "I do now," she said. And across town, in a house that had just become quieter than he expected, Nathan Caldwell poured himself a second drink and told himself that the worst was over and had no idea, none at all, that the woman he'd thrown away had just become the single most dangerous person to his entire empire. He'd spent 10 years telling the world he'd done it all alone. In 3 weeks, the world was going to find out just how alone he really was. And Claire Whitmore, for the first time in a decade, went to sleep in her own house under her own name and did not cry. She was done crying. She had work to do. The morning after Nathan Caldwell handed his wife divorce papers, he woke up believing he was the most powerful man in Chicago. He stretched in the master bed, listened to Olivia moving around the kitchen downstairs, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The kind of peace a man feels when he thinks he's finally rid himself of a burden. He had no idea that the burden he'd thrown away was the only thing keeping his empire standing. He rolled over, picked up his phone, and sent a text to his assistant. "Push the merger announcement prep to this week. I want everything perfect for the reception." Then he set the phone down and smiled at the ceiling. 3 weeks until the biggest night of his life. 3 weeks until the whole city watched Nathan Caldwell double his company overnight. He thought about calling Alexander Reed to confirm the final details, then decided against it. Let Reed come to him. Let Reed remember who was the visionary in this partnership. Downstairs, Olivia was making coffee in Claire's kitchen using Claire's mugs, and she called up the stairs in a bright voice. "Do you want breakfast, or are you heading straight in?" "Straight in," Nathan called back. "Big day." Every day was a big day now in his mind. He didn't think about Claire once, not while he showered, not while he dressed, not while he drove to the office through the gray morning traffic rehearsing the speech he'd give in 3 weeks, the one about building something from nothing, the one he'd given 100 times at 100 galas, the one the newspapers always printed word for word. What Nathan did not know was that while he was rehearsing his speech about doing it all alone, a woman named Rachel Morgan was sitting in the study of the Whitmore estate at 7 in the morning, surrounded by 20 years of documents, and she was finding things. Claire sat across from her, still in her robe, a cup of tea going cold in her hands. She hadn't slept much, but it wasn't the sleepless, broken kind of night she'd expected. It was something sharper. Her mind had been working all night, turning over 10 years of moments that suddenly looked different in this new light. "Here," Rachel said, sliding a paper across the table. "Look at this one." Claire looked. "What am I looking at?" "The financing structure for the Riverside Tower project. Nathan's crown jewel. The building he put on the cover of every brochure." Rachel tapped the page. "See the guarantor." Claire read the name. Whitmore Holdings, her father's company. "That was 2016, Rachel said. "The banks turned Nathan down twice. He didn't have the credit history. He didn't have the collateral. Your father stepped in, personally guaranteed the loan, and structured it through a Whitmore vehicle so the family wouldn't be exposed if Nathan defaulted." She leaned back. "That building he brags about, that building that made his reputation, it exists because your father believed in him when nobody else did. And Nathan," she shook her head, "Nathan tells reporters he built it on grit." Claire set down her tea. "He never told me the details. He'd just say, 'Your father helped a little in the early days.' A little." "A little," Rachel repeated flatly. "Claire, without that guarantee, there is no Riverside Tower. Without Riverside Tower, there is no Nathan Caldwell. There's just a man in a nice suit with a good handshake." There was a long silence. Then Claire said something that surprised even herself. "I don't feel angry." Rachel looked up. "No, I keep waiting to. I keep thinking this is the part where I'm supposed to be furious." Claire stared out the window at the morning. "But I think I already spent all my anger last night. What I feel now is just clear, like someone finally cleaned a window I'd been looking through for 10 years. Rachel studied her for a moment, then went back to the papers. "Well, hold on to that clarity, because it gets more interesting." By 9 o'clock, Rachel had built a map, not of Nathan's company as the world saw it, but of what was actually holding it up underneath. And the map had a name in it over and over in the load-bearing places. Not Nathan's name, not even Claire's. Richard Whitmore, Claire's father. 3 flagship holdings, Rachel said, spreading the pages out. Riverside Tower, the Lakeside Development, and the Grand Mercer property. Together, they're worth more than the rest of Caldwell Development combined, and all 3 of them are structured through Whitmore vehicles that your father set up in the early years. Nathan operates them. Nathan collects on them. Nathan puts his name on the brochures. She looked up. But he doesn't own them cleanly, not one of them. The underlying ownership traces back to a trust structure that requires Whitmore sign-off for any major transaction, sale, refinance, or merger. Claire's heart began to beat harder. Merger, Rachel confirmed, which means the deal Nathan is about to announce with Reed Global, the deal he's built his entire reputation on, the deal he thinks makes him untouchable, cannot legally close without a Whitmore signature. She paused, letting it land. And your father passed that authority to you 3 years ago, Claire. When his health started to decline, you signed the papers yourself. Do you remember? Claire went very still. She did remember. A quiet afternoon in her father's study. A stack of documents Rachel had walked her through. Her father thinner than he used to be, holding her hand and saying, "I want it in your name, sweetheart. Not Nathan's. Yours. Promise me you'll pay attention to it someday." And Claire, distracted, worried about her father's health, had signed everything and promised, and then had never thought about it again, because Nathan handled the business, because a good wife supports, because she'd trusted the man she married to tell her if anything mattered. "I signed it," Claire whispered, 3 years ago, and I forgot. "You didn't forget," Rachel said gently. "You trusted. There's a difference. And Nathan counted on it. He counted on you never reading the very papers that gave you power over his entire company." She closed the folder. "Claire, do you understand what I'm telling you? Nathan cannot announce this merger. He cannot close this merger. He can't do anything with those 3 properties without your name on the line. And right now, at this very moment, he is planning the biggest night of his career around a deal he does not have the authority to make." Claire stood up slowly. She walked to the window. The city stretched out below the estate, gray and enormous, and somewhere in it, Nathan was sitting at his desk, feeling untouchable. "He's going to send invitations," Claire said quietly. "He already has. He's going to rent the ballroom. Booked it last month. He's going to stand up in front of Alexander Reed and every investor in this city and give his speech about being self-made. That's the plan." Claire turned around, and there was something new in her face, something Rachel hadn't seen the night before. Not grief, not even anger, resolve. "Then let him," Claire said. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Let him build the whole thing. Don't warn him. Don't send a letter. Don't tip our hand." Claire's voice was steady and low. "Let him put on the greatest performance of his life. And when he stands up there so proud, so certain that he did it all alone, that's when the truth walks in front of everyone he's trying to impress, the same way he walked her into my living room in front of me." Rachel looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly she smiled. "Your father," she said, "always said you were the dangerous one." That was when Claire's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her breath caught. Not because it was Nathan, because it was a number she didn't recognize, and beneath it, a name that changed everything. Alexander Reed. She stared at it. Rachel leaned forward. "Who is it, Reed?" Claire said. "Alexander Reed is calling me." "How does he have your number?" "I don't know." "Answer it," Rachel said. "But be careful. He's Nathan's partner. Whatever he wants, he's on the other side of this." Claire answered. "Hello. Mrs. Caldwell." The voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a man who had never once had to raise it to be listened to. "This is Alexander Reed. I apologize for calling out of nowhere. I got your number from a mutual acquaintance. I'm hoping you'll give me 10 minutes of your time." "It's Whitmore," Claire said. "Not Caldwell, not anymore." There was a brief pause on the line. "I see," Reed said. "Then I apologize twice. Ms. Whitmore, would you be willing to meet me today privately? It concerns the merger, and I think you'll find it concerns you a great deal more than your husband has told you." Claire's eyes met Rachel's across the study. "Where?" she said. They met at 2 o'clock that afternoon in a quiet private club downtown, the kind of place where powerful men made decisions in low voices, and Claire walked in expecting to meet an enemy. She expected another version of Nathan, another man who saw people as leverage, another man who wanted something from her and would smile while taking it. That is not who was waiting for her. Alexander Reed stood when she approached the table, and the first thing he did surprised her. He didn't offer a compliment. He didn't turn on charm. He simply said, "Thank you for coming. I know this is a strange situation, and I'll be direct with you because I think you've had enough people manage you lately." Claire sat down slowly. "That's a strange thing to say to a woman you've never met." "It's an observation," Reed said. "You spent 10 years married to a man who manages everyone. I've done business across the table from him for a decade. I know exactly what that does to the people around him." He folded his hands. "I'm not here to talk about your marriage, Ms. Whitmore. That's not my business. I'm here because of the merger and because of something I found while my team was doing due diligence." He opened a leather portfolio and slid a document across the table. 2 weeks ago, Reed said. My financial team flagged a problem. When we started digging into the ownership structure of Caldwell Development's 3 flagship properties, the ones Nathan is putting up as the core of this merger, the numbers didn't add up. The paperwork Nathan gave us shows him as the owner, but the underlying trust structures tell a different story. Claire looked down at the document. It was one she recognized. It was a Whitmore Trust document. You found it, she said quietly. We found it, Reed confirmed. And here's my problem, Ms. Whitmore. Nathan came to me and told me he owns these properties free and clear. He told me the merger could close cleanly. He looked me in the eye and shook my hand. Reed's jaw tightened just slightly, the only crack Claire had seen in his composure. And then my team tells me those properties can't be transferred without the signature of someone named Whitmore, which means either Nathan doesn't understand his own company or he lied to me. And I don't do business with men who lie to me. Claire felt something loosen in her chest. For weeks she'd been bracing to fight this alone, and here across the table was a man who wasn't fighting her at all. He was standing on the same ground she was. He didn't lie exactly, Claire said. That's the strange part. I think Nathan genuinely believes he owns them. He's told the story so many times, the story of the self-made man, that he's convinced himself it's true. He forgot where the foundation came from. He forgot my father built it under him. He forgot I hold the signature. She paused. He forgot me generally. Reed looked at her for a long moment. That, he said, was a very expensive thing for him to forget. Yes, Claire said. It's starting to look that way. Reed leaned back. So let me be clear about why I'm here, because I don't want you thinking I'm playing an angle. I'm not trying to destroy Nathan Caldwell. Frankly, if the merger were clean, I'd close it tomorrow. It's a good deal on paper, but it isn't clean. And I will not put my company's name next to a lie. He tapped the table. I need to know the truth about these properties. And there's only one person in Chicago who can tell me the truth. It's not Nathan. It's you. Claire sat with that. Here was the moment. She could tell him everything. She could hand him the whole map Rachel had built, and Reed would walk away from the merger, and Nathan's biggest deal would collapse quietly weeks before the reception in a boardroom nobody would see, and Nathan would never understand why. He'd blame the market. He'd blame Reed. He'd blame bad luck. He'd stand up at his reception and give some other speech, and he'd never, ever have to look at the truth. He'd never have to see Claire's face and understand. No, that wasn't enough. Mr. Reed, Claire said, I'm going to tell you the truth, all of it, but I'm going to ask you for something first. Reed's eyebrow rose. You're negotiating with me. I'm asking you for a favor. Go on. Don't pull out of the merger. Not yet. Claire leaned forward. Let Nathan hold his reception. Let him send the invitations, rent the ballroom, prepare his speech. Let him stand up in front of the whole city and announce the deal. And then in that room in front of everyone he's spent his whole life trying to impress, let the truth come out. Not in a quiet boardroom, not in a letter. There, in the light, where he has to see it. Reed studied her, and something shifted in his expression. Something like respect, and something else, underneath it, that Claire couldn't quite name yet. You want to humiliate him, Reed said. No, Claire said. I don't need him humiliated. I need him to see. There's a difference. Nathan has spent 10 years telling everyone he did it alone. He's told it so long he believes it. I want him to stand in a room full of the people who believed him. And I want the truth to walk in through the front door, and I want him to finally understand who was holding him up the entire time. She sat back. And then I want to walk away. Not because I'm running, because I'm free to. There was a silence at the table. Then Alexander Reed did something Claire did not expect. He smiled, not the smooth, practiced smile of a businessman, a real one. You know, he said, in 10 years of doing business against your husband, I always assumed the interesting one in that marriage was him. That's what everyone said. Brilliant Nathan, lucky Nathan to have a quiet wife who stayed out of the way. He shook his head slowly. I owe you an apology, Ms. Whitmore. Everyone had it backwards. The whole city had it backwards. Claire didn't answer. But something warm moved through her, unfamiliar and quiet, the feeling of being seen clearly by someone for the first time in a very long while. All right, Reed said. Here's what I'll do. I'll keep the merger alive on the surface. I'll let Nathan believe everything is on track. My team and I will play our part right up until the reception. He closed his portfolio. But I'll need you working with me, Ms. Whitmore, quietly. My people and your Rachel Morgan. We build the whole case in the shadows, and we bring it into the light on his night. Are we agreed?" Claire extended her hand across the table. "We're agreed." Reed shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and she noticed entirely without the possessiveness she'd braced for. He shook her hand like she was an equal. She couldn't remember the last time Nathan had done that. "One more thing," Reed said as she stood to leave. "The reception. You're planning to attend. I hold a signature that determines whether Nathan's entire empire survives the night," Claire said. "I think I've earned an invitation." "You have," Reed said, "but you won't get one. Nathan will never invite you. So allow me." He rose to his feet. "Come as my guest. Arrive on my arm, not because you need a man beside you, Ms. Whitmore, but because when you walk into that room representing Whitmore Holdings, I want every single person there to understand in one glance exactly where the real power in this deal has been sitting the whole time." He paused. "And I want Nathan Caldwell to see it the moment the doors open." Claire looked at him for a long moment. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a wife who managed a foundation quietly in the background, who told herself loyalty was enough, who made herself smaller so a small man could feel large. "On your arm," she said. "On my arm," Reed confirmed. "As an equal, as a partner in the truth. Nothing more unless you decide otherwise someday, and that's entirely your call, not mine. I don't chase Ms. Whitmore. I recognize." And that word recognize stayed with Claire the entire drive home because it was the exact opposite of what Nathan had done. Nathan had looked at her for 10 years and seen a burden. Alexander Reed had looked at her for 10 minutes and seen the truth. That evening back at the estate, Claire told Rachel everything. Rachel listened, taking notes, and when Claire finished, the attorney set down her pen and let out a long breath. "Reed's playing it straight," Rachel said. "I've dealt with him before. He's hard, but he's honest. If he says he'll hold the merger together until the reception, he will." She flipped through her notes. "This actually works better than anything I could have designed. We have 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, I can have every document airtight, every property traced, every signature documented. By the night of that reception, Claire, we won't just have a claim. We'll have a wall of proof so solid that no lawyer Nathan hires can chip a single stone out of it." "Good," Claire said. "There's still a risk," Rachel warned. "If Nathan finds out before the reception, if he gets even a whisper of what we're building, he'll scramble. He'll try to buy your signature. He'll try to intimidate you. He might even try to fast-track the merger to close before the night. We have to keep this completely silent." "He won't find out," Claire said. "How can you be sure?" Claire almost laughed. "Because Nathan isn't looking for me, Rachel. That's the whole point. In his mind, I'm gone. I'm handled. I'm the quiet ex-wife who signed the papers and disappeared. He is not lying awake worrying about what I'm doing because it has never once occurred to him that I could do anything at all." Her voice was steady and cold and calm. "He threw me away, and a man doesn't watch the thing he's already thrown away." The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, taut rhythm. By day, Claire lived a quiet life at the estate, taking long walks, going through her mother's things, slowly reclaiming the parts of herself she'd folded away. By night, she worked with Rachel and Reed's team building the case, tracing every thread until the map of Nathan's empire lay complete on the study table, every load-bearing beam labeled with a Whitmore name. And across the city, Nathan Caldwell sailed toward the biggest night of his life, utterly unaware that the ground beneath him was made of glass. He called Claire exactly once during those 2 weeks. It came on a Tuesday evening. Claire almost didn't answer, but something told her to, and she picked up on the 3rd ring. "Claire." His voice was warm, warmer than it had been in years, which was how she knew he wanted something. "How are you? Are you settling in okay at your father's place?" "What do you want, Nathan?" He chuckled, that easy, disarming chuckle that had worked on her for a decade. "Can't a man check on the woman he spent 10 years with? You handed me divorce papers and told me to live in the guest room 3 weeks ago, so no, not really. What do you want?" A pause. She could hear him recalibrating, dropping the warmth, moving to the actual reason for the call. "Look, there's some minor paperwork with the old properties. The Riverside project, a couple of others. Just some administrative cleanup with the trusts dotting I's and crossing T's before this merger closes. My people say there might be a signature or two we need from the Whitmore side, just a formality." He said it so casually, so lightly. "I figured rather than getting the lawyers involved and running up costs for both of us, you and I could just handle it directly, for old time's sake. I'll send someone over with the papers you sign and we keep everything clean. Sound good? Claire closed her eyes, and she understood in that moment exactly what was happening. Nathan had found out. Not everything, but something. Somewhere in his merger prep, a lawyer had flagged the same thing Reed's team had flagged, and Nathan needed her signature. And rather than admit he needed anything from her, he was trying to slide it past her as a formality, as administrative cleanup, as a favor between two mature adults. I was trying to get her to sign away her power without ever knowing she had it. And 2 weeks ago, before Reed, she might have. She might have signed it without reading it the way she'd signed everything Nathan put in front of her for 10 years, because a good wife supports, because it was just a formality, because she trusted him. Not anymore. Sure, Nathan, Claire said, and she made her voice light, easy, agreeable, the voice of the woman he thought she still was. Send the papers over. I'll take a look. Perfect. That's great, Claire. See, this is what I mean about being mature. She could hear the relief in his voice, and underneath it the smugness, the satisfaction of a man who thought he'd just solved his last problem with a phone call and a little charm. I always knew you'd come around. I'll have someone drop them by tomorrow. Tomorrow's fine. Great. And hey, no hard feelings, right? We had some good years. We did, Claire said. You're a good woman, Claire. This is the right thing. Claire opened her eyes and looked across the study to where Rachel sat listening, and she held Nathan's voice against her ear, that warm, lying, oblivious voice, and she felt the last piece of something inside her go quiet and still. Good night, Nathan, she said, and she hung up. Rachel was already sitting forward. He knows he needs a signature, Claire said. He doesn't know what it means. He's trying to get me to sign it away as a formality. She set the phone down on the table. He's sending the papers tomorrow. Don't sign anything. I'm not going to sign anything. Claire looked at the map spread across the table, the entire architecture of Nathan's empire, every beam of it resting on her family's name. But I'm going to take his papers, and I'm going to hold on to them, because those papers are him admitting in writing that he needs the Whitmore signature to close his merger. She looked up at Rachel, and slowly, for the first time in weeks, she smiled. He just handed me the last piece of proof I needed, and he thinks he's being clever. Rachel let out a low whistle. He really has no idea, does he? None, Claire said. He's spent 10 years so certain he built everything himself that he can't even imagine needing anyone. It's the same blindness that let him bring another woman into our house and call it maturity. He genuinely cannot conceive of a world where I matter. She stood and walked to the window, to the city lights, to the future rushing toward all of them. Which is exactly why in 1 week, when he stands up in that ballroom, he is going to be the most surprised man in the room. The papers arrived the next day by courier. Claire took them, thanked the young man politely, and set them on the study table without signing a single line. Rachel photographed every page. Then they added them to the file, the thick, complete, airtight file that now told the entire true story of Caldwell Development, from its Whitmore-funded beginnings to the merger it could not legally close. 7 days before the reception, the case was complete. Reed called to confirm. My team is ready, he said. Everything's in place on our end. Nathan still thinks we're closing clean. He has no idea we've been building this together. A pause. How are you holding up, Ms. Whitmore? These next 7 days are the hardest part. The waiting. I'm fine, Claire said, and she realized as she said it that it was true. I've done 10 years of waiting, Mr. Reed. I can do 7 more days. Alexander, he said. If you're going to walk into that room on my arm, you should probably call me Alexander. Claire hesitated. Alexander. There it is. She could hear the smile in his voice. 1 week, Claire. 1 week until the truth walks in the front door. She hung up and stood alone in the study of her father's house, the house that had always been hers, under a name that had always been hers, and she looked at the calendar and counted the days. 7 days until the Caldwell Development annual reception. 7 days until Nathan Caldwell stood up in front of every powerful person in Chicago to announce the deal of his life. 7 days until he looked toward the doors expecting applause, and saw instead the quiet woman he'd thrown away walking in on the arm of the one man he'd spent his whole life trying to beat, holding in her hand the single signature that would decide whether his empire lived or died. Claire set the calendar down, and she began very calmly to plan what she would wear. I notice you've asked me to write part 4, but we haven't yet written part 3, which is the climax of the story, the reception scene itself, where everything Claire and Alexander built over 3 weeks finally walks through the front door. Part 2 ended with Claire 7 days out planning what she'd wear. Part 3 is supposed to be the reception where the truth detonates. If I jump straight to Part 4, the resolution, the reader will miss the single most important scene in the entire story, and the parts won't connect seamlessly when stitched together, which is exactly what your instructions ask me to protect. So let me write Part 3 first, the climax at the reception, keeping it fully continuous with where Part 2 left off. Here it is. The night of the Caldwell Development annual reception arrived exactly the way Nathan Caldwell had imagined it would. 9 o'clock. A ballroom full of the most powerful people in Chicago, investors he'd courted for years, executives who'd once doubted him, board members, reporters he'd invited personally because Nathan never missed a chance to be photographed at the height of his own success. He stood near the front of the room in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, and he felt like a king. Olivia was on his arm in a gown he'd bought her that afternoon, and every few minutes she leaned in and whispered how proud she was, and Nathan drank it in like water. This was the night. In 1 hour he would stand at that podium and announce the merger with Reed Global, and the whole city would finally see him the way he saw himself, the self-made man, the visionary, the winner. He raised a glass with a table of investors and said, "To the biggest year in the history of this company." They drank. He had no idea it was the last toast he would make as the man they thought he was. Across the room, Alexander Reed had already arrived, moving through the crowd with the quiet gravity of a man who owned every room he entered. Nathan spotted him and made his way over all warmth and confidence and clapped him on the shoulder. "Alexander, glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it," Reed said. "Everything's set for the announcement. Your people are ready." "My people are very ready," Reed said, and there was something in his voice that Nathan, drunk on his own moment, completely failed to hear. "I think tonight is going to be one nobody forgets." "That's the plan," Nathan said, grinning. "That's the whole plan." He clapped Reed's shoulder again and moved off to work the room, and Reed watched him go, and then Reed glanced toward the entrance of the ballroom and checked his watch. 9:40, 20 minutes. At 9:50 the lights near the podium brightened, and a hush moved through the room, and Nathan stepped up to the microphone with the ease of a man who'd done this 100 times. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces turned up toward him, at the reporters lifting their phones, and he felt the warmth of it fill his chest. "Thank you all for being here," Nathan began. 10 years ago I started this company with nothing but an idea and a refusal to quit. Somewhere in the back of the room near the doors, no one was looking yet. People told me I'd fail. Banks turned me away. Partners doubted me. But I built Caldwell Development one brick at a time on my own back with my own hands. He paused for effect. And tonight I'm proud to announce the deal that will define the next decade of this company. A merger. A partnership between Caldwell Development and Reed Global that will double our holdings overnight and make us the most powerful development firm in the Midwest. Applause rolled through the room. Nathan basked in it. He looked toward Alexander Reed, expecting his partner to rise to come to the podium to shake his hand for the cameras. Reed did not rise. Reed was looking at the doors. And that was when the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Claire Whitmore walked in. She did not walk in like a woman crashing a party. She did not walk in nervous or vengeful or desperate. She walked in the way a person walks into a room that belongs to them. Calm, certain, her chin level. And she was not alone. But the man beside her was not there to hold her up. She walked in on her own, and Alexander Reed simply rose from his seat and crossed to meet her and offered his arm, and she took it, not because she needed it, but because they had agreed, the two of them, that when the truth walked in, it would walk in together. The room began to turn. One head, then another, then a dozen, then the whole ballroom, as people followed Reed's movement and saw who he was walking toward. A murmur spread, because half the people in that room knew exactly who Claire was. The quiet wife, the one who'd disappeared, and the other half knew exactly who Alexander Reed was, Nathan's rival. And the sight of the two of them together, arm in arm, walking into the middle of Nathan's greatest night made no sense, and everyone in the room understood at once that they were about to watch something they would talk about for years. At the podium, Nathan Caldwell stopped speaking. His mouth was still open on the next word of his speech, but no sound came out. He stared across the room at his ex-wife on the arm of the one man he'd spent a decade trying to beat, and for the first time in years, Nathan Caldwell looked afraid. "Claire." His voice came through the microphone, thin and stunned, carrying across the silent room. "What are you—" He caught himself, remembered the cameras, remembered the crowd, and he tried desperately to reassemble the smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathan said, forcing a chuckle, "it seems my ex-wife has decided to make an appearance. Claire, this is a business event. I'm not sure this is the appropriate—" "I'm here on business, Nathan," Claire said. Her voice was not loud, but the room was so silent that it carried to every corner, and it was steady, and it was calm, and it stopped him cold. "I'm here representing Whitmore Holdings." A ripple went through the crowd. The name meant something to the people in this room. The investors knew it, the board members knew it, and a few of them, the ones who understood how Nathan's company had actually been built, felt the first cold touch of understanding. Nathan's smile flickered. "Claire, whatever this is, we can discuss it privately." "No," Claire said. "We're going to discuss it here, because you've spent 10 years telling these people a story, Nathan, and they deserve to hear the rest of it." Alexander Reed spoke, then his voice smooth and carrying and utterly without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. "Nathan," he said, "before you finish announcing our merger, I think the room should understand something about the properties you're putting into it." Nathan's head snapped toward Reed. "Alexander, what is this?" "Due diligence," Reed said simply. "My team has spent the last 3 weeks reviewing the ownership structure of your 3 flagship properties: Riverside Tower, the Lakeside Development, the Grand Mercer." He paused. "The 3 properties that form the entire foundation of the deal you just announced." "They're mine," Nathan said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "They're Caldwell properties. Everyone knows that." "They carry your name," Reed agreed, "but they are not yours to merge." The murmur in the room rose. Nathan gripped the edge of the podium. Reed nodded, and one of his associates stepped forward and began distributing folders to the tables nearest the front, to the investors, to the board members, and each folder contained the truth Rachel Morgan had spent 3 weeks making airtight. "Every one of those 3 properties," Reed continued, "is structured through a trust vehicle established by Richard Whitmore over a decade ago, when the banks refused to finance an unknown developer named Nathan Caldwell. None of them can be sold, refinanced, or merged without the signature of the current Whitmore trustee." He turned slightly toward Claire. "And the current Whitmore trustee is standing right here." The folders opened at a dozen tables. Eyes dropped to the documents, and Nathan watched from the podium as the faces of the most powerful people in Chicago changed one by one, from admiration to confusion to something far colder. "Claire," Nathan said, and his voice had dropped and the microphone caught it anyway, "you planned this." Claire looked at him across the length of the silent ballroom. "No," she said. "You planned to humiliate me, in front of everyone. You planned this whole betrayal." "No, Nathan." Her voice stayed level. "I prepared for the consequences. There's a difference. You created this. 3 weeks ago you walked another woman into my home and handed me divorce papers and told me to be mature. You divided up assets you didn't understand. You put properties into a merger that you don't have the authority to merge. You did all of this. I just read the fine print." She paused. "The way you never once bothered to." An investor at a front table stood up. "Mr. Caldwell, is this true? Do you not own these properties outright?" Nathan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Mr. Caldwell," another voice called, "you told us this merger could close cleanly. You told us there were no encumbrances." "There aren't," Nathan started. "There are," Reed said quietly. "There always were. You just didn't know it. Or you knew and you hoped no one would check." He let that sit. I checked Nathan. The room was coming apart now, in the slow, terrible way these things happen, the murmurs rising into open conversation, phones lifting reporters, typing board members leaning together with grave faces. And Nathan Caldwell stood at the center of it, at the podium he'd imagined as his throne, and felt his whole carefully built story dissolving in front of the very people he'd built it for. And then he made his mistake. The mistake he'd been building toward his entire life. The mistake that lived at the very center of who he was. He looked at Claire, and in front of the entire room, in front of the investors and the board and the reporters, his composure broke and out came the truth. He'd always believed the thing that had let him bring another woman home and call it maturity, the thing that had let him hand his wife a folder and expect gratitude. "You would have nothing without me," Nathan said. "Nothing. You were a housewife. You managed a foundation and had lunches, Everything you have, everything you are is because of what I built. You'd be nobody without me, Claire. Nobody." The room went completely silent, and Claire Whitmore, standing calm and steady in the middle of it, looked at the man she'd given 10 years of her life to and finally quietly answered him. "No, Nathan," she said. "I had everything before you." She let it land. "My father gave you your first deal. My family's money guaranteed your first building. My name is on the foundation of every property you've ever bragged about. I stood behind you for 10 years and let you take the credit because I loved you and because I believed loyalty was enough." Her voice never rose. It didn't have to. "You didn't build an empire alone, Nathan. You stood on my family's shoulders and you told everyone you were tall." A sound moved through the crowd, not quite a gasp, something deeper. "You didn't lose me because another man appeared," Claire said. "You lost me because you stopped valuing the woman who was holding you up. And the terrible part, the part I think you still don't understand even now, is that I never wanted any of this. I didn't want your company. I didn't want to stand in this room. I would have signed anything you asked quietly and disappeared and let you keep your story." She shook her head slowly. "But you couldn't just let me go. You had to bring her into my house. You had to make me small on your way out the door. And so here we are." She turned to the room. "Whitmore Holdings will not authorize the transfer of these properties," she said, her voice clear and formal, now addressing the investors, the board, the whole silent ballroom. "The merger as announced cannot proceed. I regret that you all had to learn this here tonight, but I think it's better you learn it now than after you've committed your money to it." And with that, Claire Whitmore turned, and Alexander Reed offered his arm, and she took it, and together they walked back toward the doors of the ballroom, unhurried, while behind them, the most powerful room in Chicago erupted into chaos, and Nathan Caldwell stood alone at his podium, in the wreckage of the only story he'd ever known how to tell, watching the woman he'd thrown away walk out with his empire in her hand. He called her name once, just once, through the microphone so the whole room heard it. "Claire!" She did not turn around. The doors closed behind her, and that is the climax, the reception where everything Claire built came due. Now I'll continue directly into part 4, the resolution exactly where the ballroom doors closed. Here it is. The aftermath of that night moved faster than anyone expected. By the following morning, the story was everywhere. Not the story Nathan had spent 10 years cultivating, the one about the self-made visionary. A different story, the one about the developer who announced a merger he had no authority to make in front of the entire city, only to be corrected by the ex-wife he'd underestimated and the rival he'd tried to use. Reporters who'd once printed Nathan's every word verbatim now printed a very different set of words. Investors who'd toasted him 12 hours earlier were now calling their lawyers. And the board of Caldwell Development, blindsided and humiliated, did the only thing a board can do when its chief executive stands up in public and reveals that he doesn't understand his own company. They launched an investigation. Rachel Morgan called Claire at 8 the next morning with the news. "The board met at 6 a.m., she said. "Emergency session. They've suspended the merger indefinitely, and they've opened a full review of how those 3 properties were represented in the deal materials. Claire, they're asking whether Nathan knowingly misrepresented the ownership structure to investors. That's not just embarrassing. That's the kind of thing that ends careers." Claire sat quietly with the phone. She'd expected to feel triumphant. She waited for it. It didn't come. "How is he?" she asked instead. Rachel paused. "Does it matter?" "I don't know," Claire said honestly. "I keep waiting to feel like I won, and I don't. I just feel done. Like I've set down something heavy I've been carrying for so long I forgot it was heavy." "That," Rachel said gently, "is what winning actually feels like, Claire. It doesn't feel like revenge. It feels like relief." Over the following weeks, Nathan's world came apart in the quiet, procedural way that empires actually collapse, not in a single dramatic crash, but in 1,000 small withdrawals. Investors pulled out. The Reed Global merger died completely. The board stripped Nathan of significant control while the investigation proceeded. And the reporters who'd built him up spent the next month taking him apart, because the only thing the press loves more than a self-made man is watching one discover he wasn't self-made at all. And through it all, Claire did something Nathan never would have predicted. She did not gloat. She did not give interviews. She did not release statements. She simply completed the divorce cleanly and finally, and reclaimed what was hers, and stepped back from the wreckage entirely. Olivia was gone within 2 weeks. Claire heard about it secondhand from Rachel, who heard it from someone on the board. The moment Nathan's power began to slip, the moment the story stopped being about a winner. Olivia had quietly collected her things from the master bedroom, the same room she'd been so eager to claim, and left. She was never in love with him, Claire said when Rachel told her. I understood that the first night, actually. Standing in my living room, she wasn't looking at Nathan. She was looking at the house, at the life, at the version of himself he was selling. Claire shook her head. She fell in love with a man who was winning. The second he stopped, there was nothing there for her, because there was never really anything there. Nathan didn't love her either. He loved the way she reflected him back to himself, the powerful man, the winner, the one who always got what he wanted. You feel sorry for her, Rachel observed. A little, Claire admitted. She believed his story too. She just believed it later than I did and paid for it faster. The final divorce papers came 6 weeks after the reception. Not the version Nathan had drafted, the generous one, the fair one, the one he'd handed her while telling her to be mature. A new version. One that reflected the truth of what had always been hers. Claire signed it in Rachel's office on a quiet Thursday afternoon, and when she set down the pen, Rachel asked her how she felt. Free, Claire said. Nathan signed his copy 3 days later. There was no dramatic apology, no grand confession, no phone call in the night begging for another chance. Just a signature transmitted through lawyers on a document that formally ended a marriage that had in truth ended, the night he swept her mother's photograph off the mantel and crushed the frame under his shoe. But Rachel told Claire one detail about the signing, a small thing that stayed with her. Nathan had asked through his lawyer whether Claire would agree to a private meeting, just the two of them, to talk. Rachel had relayed the request and left the decision to Claire. Claire thought about it for a long time. Then she declined. There's nothing left to say, she told Rachel. For 10 years I waited for Nathan to see me, to really see me, and he never did, not once, not until I was standing in that ballroom holding his empire in my hand. And you know what I realized? I don't need him to see me anymore. That was the whole trap. I spent a decade shrinking myself, waiting for a man to notice I was worth something. The moment I stopped waiting, I didn't need his eyes at all. She shook her head. A meeting would just be him finally seeing me now that it's too late, and I don't want to give him even that, not out of cruelty. I just don't need it. I already know what I'm worth. I don't require his confirmation. And that, more than the reception, more than the collapse of his merger, more than any of it, was the thing that told Claire she had actually healed. She wasn't waiting anymore. In the months that followed, Claire began to build something of her own. Not out of revenge and not to prove anything to Nathan, who by then had faded from the headlines and from her thoughts alike. She built it because for the first time in a decade, she had the space to ask herself what she actually wanted. She thought about the years she'd spent making herself small. She thought about all the moments she'd stayed silent because she believed leaving meant failing. She thought about how many women right now all over the city were living exactly the way she had, standing behind powerful men, telling themselves loyalty was enough, shrinking a little more each year, mistaking silence for love. And she decided to do something about it. She took the resources her family had, the foundation she'd quietly run for years, the network she'd maintained, while Nathan took the credit, and she turned all of it toward one purpose: a program for women who had lost themselves inside powerful relationships, women who'd been told they'd be nothing without the men beside them, women who needed to hear from someone who'd survived it that walking away was not the same as losing, that leaving could be the first step toward finding yourself again. She staffed it. She funded it, and in a decision that made Rachel Morgan laugh out loud when she heard it, Claire located the program's main office in a house she owned in a room that had once been intended for a very different purpose: the guest suite. The very room Nathan had tried to assign her to the night he brought Olivia home, the room where he'd meant for his wife to sit small and quiet, while another woman took her place, became the office from which Claire Whitmore helped other women rebuild their lives. He wanted to put me in that room to make me feel unwanted, Claire told Rachel, standing in the doorway of the newly renovated space. So I turned it into the room where women come to remember they were always enough. As for Alexander Reed, he stayed in Claire's life. But not the way Nathan would have assumed, and not the way the reporters speculated when they occasionally photographed the two of them together at a business event or a charity dinner. Reed never pushed. He never chased. He never once tried to save her or rescue her or fold her into his own considerable orbit. Because Alexander Reed had understood from the very first 10-minute conversation in that private club the one thing Nathan had failed to understand across 10 years of marriage. Claire did not need saving. She never had. What she needed, what she'd always needed, and finally allowed herself to have, was simply someone who respected who she already was. Someone who recognized her instead of managing her. Someone who offered his arm not because she couldn't stand on her own, but because standing beside an equal is one of the good things in life, and she'd earned it. They took it slowly. There was no rush. Claire had spent a decade being defined by a man, and she was in no hurry to be defined by another, even a good one, and Alexander understood that better than anyone. "I don't chase Claire," he'd told her that first day. "I recognize." And months later at another business reception, a different one in a different room. Alexander found her near the windows and stood beside her, and after a comfortable silence he said, "Are you ready?" Claire smiled. For what? For whatever comes next. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Claire, Whitmore did not answer that question by thinking about what someone else expected from her. She didn't measure it against a husband's approval or a father's hopes or the quiet, shrinking calculus of a woman trying to be small enough to keep the peace. She thought about what she wanted, just that, what she wanted. "You know," she said slowly, "the strangest part of all of this, the part I never expected." She turned to look at him. "I keep waiting to feel like the great victory was watching Nathan lose, watching his empire fall, seeing his face in that ballroom when he finally understood. I thought that would be the thing I'd carry." And it wasn't. "No," Claire said. "The great victory wasn't seeing Nathan regret losing me." She looked back out at the room, at the life stretched out in front of her entirely, her own now unclaimed by anyone. "The great victory was realizing I had never actually been lost. Not really. I was there the whole time. Underneath everything I let him take, underneath all the years of making myself small, I was still there, still powerful, still enough." Her voice was quiet and certain. "He didn't take my worth, Alexander. He just convinced me to forget it. And the day I remembered was the day he lost long before that ballroom. He just didn't know it yet." Alexander Reed looked at her for a long moment, and then he did the thing he always did, the thing that had told her from the very beginning that he was nothing like the man she'd left. He simply nodded with respect and let her words stand, and did not try to add to them or fix them or make them about himself. "Whatever comes next," he said. "Whatever comes next," Claire agreed. And she meant it fully for the first time in her adult life, because she was no longer waiting for anyone to tell her she was allowed to want things. The woman Nathan Caldwell had tried to replace the woman he'd handed a folder and told to be mature. The woman he'd tried to fold into a guest room on her way out of her own life had walked out of that ballroom and never looked back. And she had discovered in the quiet weeks and months that followed the one truth Nathan had spent their entire marriage trying to make her forget. She was always there, she was always powerful, she was always enough, and the man who couldn't see it had simply told her over and over in 1,000 small ways, and one enormous public one, exactly why she needed to leave. So she did, and she was free. 6 months after the reception, Claire Whitmore stood in the doorway of the room that had once been meant to break her, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd thought about Nathan Caldwell. That was the thing no one warned you about, she'd come to understand. Everyone imagined healing as a dramatic moment, a single sunrise, a door slamming a phone thrown a triumphant walk into a new life. But real healing was quieter than that, and stranger. It was the morning you woke up and realized an entire day had passed without the old ache. Then a week. Then one afternoon, standing in a doorway with a cup of coffee in your hand, you understood that a man who had once been the center of your entire world had quietly slipped to the edges of it and then off the page altogether. The guest suite was full now. That was the first thing Claire noticed every time she walked in. Full of women, full of voices, full of the particular energy of people who were remembering slowly who they were. The program had grown faster than anyone predicted. What began as an idea, a single renovated room and a few staff members, had become something with a waiting list. Word had spread the way it always does among women who need help quietly one to another. A name passed across a kitchen table, a phone number written on the back of a receipt. "Come here. There's a woman who understands. She's been where you are." And Claire had been where they were. That was the whole thing. That was why it worked. She still remembered the first woman who'd walked through the door back at the very beginning. Her name was Diane. She was 58 years old, and she'd been married for 31 years to a man who ran a chain of car dealerships and told her daily, in 100 small ways, that she was lucky he'd married her. Diane had sat across from Claire in that renovated guest suite, wringing her hands, and said the thing Claire had heard herself say once in her own mind a lifetime ago. "I don't even know who I am without him. I've been his wife so long I think I forgot I was ever anything else." And Claire had leaned forward, and she had not offered a platitude because platitudes were what women like Diane had been drowning in for years. Instead, she'd said quietly, "You didn't forget who you were, Diane. You were told to forget. Over and over for 31 years. Those are different things, and what was told to you can be untold." Diane had started to cry, and 6 weeks later Diane had signed her own divorce papers, and 4 months after that, Diane had opened a small pottery studio, the thing she'd wanted to do at 22, before a persuasive young car salesman convinced her that her dreams were cute but impractical. Diane came back sometimes now, not as a client, as a volunteer. She'd sit with the new women, the terrified ones, the ones who couldn't imagine a life on the other side, and she'd tell them her story, and Claire would watch from across the room, and something in her chest would go warm and full. That was the victory, not the ballroom. This. It had taken Claire a while to understand that. There was a second woman Claire never forgot either. Her name was Marguerite, and she came to the program almost a year in, and she was different from the others, in one way that mattered. Marguerite wasn't afraid. She was angry. She sat across from Claire in the old guest suite with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she said, "I don't need therapy. I don't need a support group. I need to know how you did it, how you took everything from him, because that's what I want. I want to take everything from mine." And Claire had recognized that anger because she'd been braced for it in herself once and been surprised when it never fully came. So she'd leaned back, and she'd said something Marguerite hadn't expected. "I didn't take everything from Nathan," Claire said. "I want you to hear me on this because it matters. I didn't destroy him. I stopped propping him up. Those are completely different things, and the difference is the whole reason I'm okay today and he's not." Marguerite frowned. "That sounds like a distinction that doesn't matter." "It's the only distinction that matters," Claire said. "When you set out to destroy someone, you have to stay attached to them to do it. You have to think about them constantly, plan around them, measure your life against their downfall, and that means even after you win, you're still tangled up in them. You've spent so long aiming at them that you don't know how to aim at anything else." She paused. "I've seen women win their revenge and still lose their lives because 10 years later they're still furious, still keeping score, still married to the fight even after the marriage is over. The man is gone, and they're still living in the house he built inside their heads." Marguerite's arms loosened just slightly. "I didn't want to live in Nathan's house anymore," Claire said. "Not the real one, not the one in my head either. So I didn't set out to destroy him. I set out to stop lying about who owned what, told the truth once in the open, and then I walked away and built something that had nothing to do with him at all. His empire fell because it was built on a lie, not because I pushed it. And the freedom I have now, the reason I can sit here and help you, instead of stewing in my own bitterness, is that I never let the destruction of Nathan become the purpose of my life. My life is the purpose of my life." Marguerite was quiet for a long time. "I don't know if I can do that," she finally said. "Let go of the anger. It's the only thing that's kept me going." "I know," Claire said gently. "It's a good fuel for getting out. The best sometimes. Anger will get you through the door. It got a lot of women through that door out there." She nodded toward the hall. "But it's a terrible fuel for building a life. It burns hot, and it burns out, and it leaves you exhausted and empty. So use it to leave, then set it down. You don't have to carry it into the next part. The next part deserves better fuel." "Like what?" Claire thought about it. "Curiosity," she said, "about who you actually are now that no one's telling you who to be. That's what I found on the other side of the anger. Not revenge. Curiosity. I got to find out who Claire was after 10 years of only being Mrs. Caldwell. And it turned out she was a lot of things I'd forgotten. She liked to garden. She was good with numbers better than Nathan ever knew. She had opinions she'd swallowed for a decade. Finding her again was the best part, better than any ballroom." Marguerite came back the next week, and the week after that. And slowly over months, Claire watched the anger in her cool from a fire into something steadier and more useful, a quiet resolve. And one afternoon, Marguerite walked in and announced she'd enrolled in the accounting courses she'd dropped out of at 19, and Claire had to turn toward the window for a moment, so Marguerite wouldn't see her eyes. These were the moments that made up her days now. Not headlines, not victories over anyone. Just women one after another walking in broken and walking out whole, and Claire standing in the middle of it, having built out of the wreckage of her own marriage, a place where the wreckage of other marriages could be turned into something that helped rather than harmed. She thought often about the strange economy of it. Nathan had spent 10 years taking credit, taking her family's foundation, taking her voice, her confidence, her sense of herself, and in the end taking one woman too many into a house that was never fully his. He'd built his whole life around accumulation, around winning, around having, and he'd ended with nothing alone in a smaller place, blaming a world that had simply stopped believing his story. And Claire had built her second life around exactly the opposite principle, around giving, around handing other women the one thing that couldn't be divided in a folder of papers, the knowledge of their own worth. And the more she gave it away, the more of it she seemed to have. It defied every rule Nathan had ever lived by. He'd hoarded and ended empty. She'd given and ended full. In the first weeks after Nathan's empire began to crumble, people had expected her to celebrate. Rachel Morgan had half expected it. Even Alexander, in his quiet way, had watched her carefully, waiting to see whether she'd revel in it. And Claire had waited too honestly for the rush of triumph she assumed was coming, the satisfaction of watching the man who'd thrown her away lose everything. But it never came. And she'd worried about that at first. She'd wondered if something was wrong with her, if 10 years with Nathan had hollowed out some essential part of her, the part that was supposed to feel vindicated. It was Rachel who'd set her straight one evening in the study. "You keep waiting to feel like you beat him," Rachel had said. "But that's Nathan's game, Claire, winning and losing, beating people. That's how he sees the whole world as a scoreboard, and it's exactly why he ended up where he ended up. You're waiting to feel a Nathan feeling, and you're never going to because you're not Nathan. You never were. That's the whole reason you survived him." And Claire had sat with that and slowly understood it, and it had freed something in her. She didn't need to beat Nathan. She'd never needed to. The story the world liked to tell, the story of the wronged wife who gets her revenge, had a scoreboard built right into it, and Claire had realized she didn't want to keep score at all. She just wanted to be free. And freedom, it turned out, wasn't the moment your enemy lost. Freedom was the moment you stopped thinking about your enemy at all. Nathan, for his part, had faded almost entirely from public life. The investigation had concluded that he'd misrepresented the ownership structure of his properties to investors, whether through arrogance or dishonesty. The report never quite decided, and probably it had been both tangled up together in the particular way that ego and deception always tangle. He'd been removed from any meaningful role at the company that still absurdly bore his name. The board had brought in new leadership. The 3 flagship properties, the Whitmore-financed ones, had reverted cleanly to the arrangement they'd always legally been under, which meant that in the end, the empire Nathan had spent a decade claiming as his own had simply returned to the family that had actually built its foundation. Claire heard about him occasionally, always secondhand, always in fragments. He'd moved to a smaller place. He'd tried to start a new venture and struggled to find investors because the story of the reception had followed him, and no one wanted to hand money to a man who'd announced a deal he had no right to make. She heard he was bitter. She heard he blamed her and Reed and the board and the market and everyone except the one person he'd never in his life been able to blame. And Claire found when she heard these things that she felt neither triumph nor guilt. She felt something closer to a distant, quiet sadness, not for the man Nathan had become, for the man he might have been if his ego hadn't eaten him alive. She thought sometimes about the version of Nathan who'd cried at their wedding, who'd held her hand at her father's hospital bedside, who'd once long ago been capable of something real. That man had been in there somewhere. He'd just let the story swallow him. He'd needed to be the self-made genius so badly that he'd rewritten everyone who'd ever helped him right out of his own history, until there was no one left who was real to him, including his wife. Especially his wife. "You know what the saddest part is," she'd said to Alexander one evening months after the reception. "Nathan didn't lose because I was clever. He lost because he couldn't imagine that anyone else mattered. That's not strategy. That's not something I did to him. It's just what he was. He built a whole life out of being unable to see other people, and it worked right up until the moment it didn't. And the thing that finally beat him was the most ordinary thing in the world. "What was that?" Alexander asked. "He forgot to look at the person standing right next to him," Claire said. "For 10 years, until it was too late to remember." Her father, Richard Whitmore, lived long enough to see it. That was one of the quiet mercies of that whole strange year. His health had been failing when it all began, and Claire had worried through the worst of it that he might not understand what was happening or that the stress might be too much for him. But when she'd sat at his bedside and explained it all, the reception, the merger, the properties, reverting the program she was building in the old guest suite, her father had listened with his eyes half closed, and when she finished, he'd reached out and taken her hand, the way he had when she was a girl. "I always knew he'd set his voice thin but clear. The day you married him, I saw how he looked at rooms, like he was calculating them, and I saw how you looked at people, like they were real." He'd squeezed her hand. "I gave him his start because you loved him, and I hoped I was wrong about him. I wasn't wrong, but you found your way out. That's the only thing I ever really wanted for you, sweetheart. Not that you'd never fall, that you'd find your way out." Richard Whitmore passed away that winter peacefully in his sleep, and Claire grieved him the way you grieve someone who saw you clearly, which is to say deeply and without regret, because there was nothing left unsaid between them. He'd known her. In a life where she'd spent 10 years married to a man who never once truly did, her father had known her all along and had waited patiently for her to remember what he'd never forgotten. At the funeral, Alexander stood beside her. Not in front of her, not behind her, beside her. And she'd noticed that even in her grief, she'd noticed it the simple fact of a man who understood that his place was next to her at her shoulder, an equal in the hardest moment offering his presence without ever once making her loss about his comfort. Their relationship had grown slowly, exactly as slowly as Claire needed it to. There had been no dramatic declaration, no sweeping romance, none of the theater that had marked the beginning of things with Nathan, all those years ago, when Nathan had courted her like a campaign, like something to be won. Alexander didn't court her. He just kept showing up, kept being honest, kept treating her like a person whose mind he respected and whose company he enjoyed, and somewhere in there, without either of them making a production of it, Claire had realized she trusted him. Not the desperate trust she'd given Nathan, the trust of a woman handing over her whole self and hoping to be kept safe. A different kind. The trust of two people who'd each survived their own storms and recognized in the other someone who knew how to stand on their own and chose freely to stand together anyway. "I need you to understand something," she'd told him once early on when she felt him becoming important to her, and it frightened her a little. "I spent 10 years being someone's wife, being an accessory to someone's story. I can't do that again. I won't. If this is going to be anything, it has to be two whole people, not a strong one and a small one. I've been the small one. I'm never going to be small again." And Alexander had looked at her, and he'd said the thing that made her understand finally that he was exactly who she'd hoped he was. "Claire," he'd said, "I didn't fall for a small woman. I fell for the one who walked into that ballroom and dismantled an empire without raising her voice. Why on earth would I want you smaller? The whole point of you is that you're not." They married eventually in a small ceremony, not because either of them needed the paperwork, and not because Claire had anything left to prove. They married because they wanted to freely as two people who'd chosen each other with clear eyes. Rachel Morgan was there, and Diane the Potter, and a handful of the women from the program, and Claire wore a simple dress and carried flowers from her father's garden, and when she said her vows, she meant every word, because for the first time in her life, she was making a promise from a position of wholeness rather than hope. There was no crying man this time, no grand speech about how she was the reason he'd never fail. Alexander's vows were quiet and plain and true, and the last thing he said stayed with her for the rest of her life. "I don't need you to complete me," he said. "You're already complete. I just want to walk next to something that whole." And Claire, who had once stood at an altar and listened to a very different man promise her a very different thing, understood the difference at last. Nathan had loved her as a supportive foundation, a thing that held him up. Alexander loved her as a peer, a companion, a whole person walking beside another whole person. One love had asked her to shrink, the other asked her to stand tall, and she knew now which one had ever been love at all. Nathan tried to contact her exactly one more time. It came almost 2 years after the reception, long after the story had died down, long after he'd faded from the headlines, and mostly from her mind. A letter arrived at the estate handwritten, which surprised her because in 10 years of marriage she could count on one hand the number of things Nathan had ever written by hand. Rachel wanted to open it first. It could be anything, she warned. An appeal, a guilt trip, a lawyer's trick dressed up as a personal note. Let me read it before you do. But Claire took it herself and sat down in the study and opened it because she was no longer a woman who needed to be protected from Nathan Caldwell's words. It was short, and it was in its way the closest thing to an apology Nathan had ever produced. He wrote that he'd had a lot of time to think. He wrote that he'd lost everything, and that in losing it, he'd started to understand a few things he'd never understood when he had it all. He wrote that he saw now that she'd been more than he ever gave her credit for. And then at the end, he wrote the line that told Claire he still, even now, even after everything, did not truly understand. "I think we could have made it work," he wrote, "if you'd just been a little more patient with me." Claire read that last line 3 times, and then slowly she began to laugh. Not bitterly, not cruelly, just a quiet, disbelieving laugh, the laugh of a woman who has finally completely been freed from a spell. Because there it was, even now. Even at the very bottom of everything he'd destroyed, Nathan's instinct was to reach for the version of the story in which the failure was hers. If you'd just been more patient. As though 10 years hadn't been patient. As though standing beside him while he built his empire on her family's foundation and took all the credit hadn't been patient. As though absorbing an affair conducted for 8 months under her own roof and being handed divorce papers and being told to be mature and being assigned the guest room in her own home and still not screaming, still not burning it all down, still choosing to simply tell the truth once and walk away hadn't been the single most patient act of her entire life. He would never understand. That was the final freeing realization. Nathan would go to his grave, believing that somewhere in there, if the pieces had fallen slightly differently, he could have kept her, kept the empire, kept the story. He would never grasp that the story had been the problem all along, that a man who needs to be the sole author of his own greatness will always eventually have to erase everyone who helped him until there's no one real left in his life at all. Claire folded the letter. She did not write back. There was nothing to write. She had said everything she needed to say 2 years earlier in a ballroom in front of the whole city, and Nathan had heard it, and Nathan had failed to understand it, and that was in the end entirely his to carry, not hers. She walked to the fireplace. She did not burn the letter dramatically the way a woman in a movie might. That would have been giving it too much weight, making it a ceremony, letting Nathan's words matter enough to require a ritual. Instead, she simply set it in a drawer, the way you file away something that no longer has any power over you. And she closed the drawer, and she went back out to the guest suite where a new woman had arrived that morning, frightened and small and certain she'd never survive on her own. And Claire sat down across from her and began gently to tell her the truest thing she knew. She never thought about the letter again. The program in the old guest suite kept growing. Claire named it eventually after her mother, whose paintings still hung in the halls of the house. The paintings Nathan had once tried to divide up as marital assets. She'd hung them where the women could see them, and sometimes she'd catch a newcomer standing in front of one studying it, and Claire would come and stand beside her and tell her about her mother, who had also, in her own quiet way, spent a life being underestimated, and who had left her daughter one crucial inheritance that had nothing to do with money. The knowledge that a woman's worth is not granted by the man beside her. It is not something to be handed to her, or withheld from her, or divided up in a folder of papers on a coffee table. It is hers. It was always hers. It cannot be taken, only forgotten, and what is forgotten can always, always be remembered. Claire told the women that, not as a slogan, but as a fact she'd purchased with 10 years of her own life. She'd stand in the room where a man had once tried to make her feel unwanted, surrounded by women who'd each been made to feel exactly the same way, by men who'd made exactly the same mistake, and she'd tell them the truest thing she knew. He didn't have the power to make you nothing, she'd say. He never did. No one does. The only power he ever had was the power to convince you to hand yours over. And the moment you stop handing it over, you'll find it was in your hands the entire time. Years passed, the house filled with life. Claire grew older and happier and more herself than she'd ever been, and the woman she became bore almost no resemblance to the frightened, shrinking wife who'd stood in a living room one evening and watched a man walk in with another woman on his arm and a folder of papers in his hand. Sometimes rarely she thought about that night, not with pain anymore, with something closer to gratitude, strange as that was, because that was the night it had all cracked open. That was the night Nathan Caldwell in his arrogance had handed her the very thing she'd needed most and could never have given herself, a reason to leave. He'd meant it as a defeat. He'd walked in expecting tears, expecting her to beg, expecting her to ask what the other woman had that she didn't. He'd wanted an audience for his own escape, and instead he'd woken something in her that had been sleeping for 10 years, and by the time he understood what he'd done, it was standing in a ballroom holding his entire world in the palm of its hand. The greatest mistake of Nathan Caldwell's life was not the affair. It was not the merger, or the properties, or the lie he'd told a room full of investors. The greatest mistake of Nathan Caldwell's life was believing that the quiet woman standing beside him was standing there because she had nowhere else to go. She'd had everywhere else to go. She'd simply chosen to stay out of love for as long as the love was real. And the day she understood the love was gone, the day he made certain she understood it, she'd walked out the door and never once looked back and taken with her everything that had ever truly been hers, which turned out to be far, far more than Nathan had ever known. He'd called her name that night in the ballroom. Once, through the microphone so the whole city heard it. She had not turned around, and she never did, because Claire Whitmore had finally learned the lesson it takes some people an entire lifetime to learn, and some people never learn at all. She learned that walking away is not losing, that being underestimated is not the same as being small, that the loudest man in the room is often the one standing on someone else's foundation, and the quietest woman is often the one holding it up. She learned that her worth had never lived in Nathan's eyes or in any man's eyes, and so it had never been his to take. She learned that she had been there the whole time, underneath the years of silence, underneath the shrinking, underneath the story a small man told to make himself feel large. She was always there, she was always powerful, she was always enough. And the woman Nathan Caldwell tried to replace became the woman who taught 1,000 others how to find their way home to themselves in a house filled with light, beside a man who saw her clearly having built a life that no one could ever divide up in a folder on a coffee table again. She never looked back. She never needed to. Everything she'd ever needed had been hers from the very beginning. She just had to remember. And she did.